You're walking through a bustling London market in 1305. The scent of fresh bread in the air, children laughing, merchants shouting, horses trotting down cobbled streets. Then suddenly, everything stops. A drum beats once. Blood splatters the stones. A man is being dragged through the streets like an animal, torn and broken. The crowd cheers, not in horror, but in triumph. You don't realize it yet, but you're not just witnessing an execution. You're part of a performance, a calculated display of power meant to break the will of an entire people. I've studied hundreds of executions from medieval England, and none were staged as symbolically or as savagely as the death of William Wallace. In just a few minutes, you'll learn how his brutal end backfired, how it turned a man into a myth, and how empires have used death as a psychological weapon for centuries. Wallace, only 35, was hanged, disemboweled alive, and quartered before a cheering crowd. But instead of dying in disgrace, his name became a rallying cry for freedom across generations and borders. Miss this story, and you'll miss the secret history of how rulers control the masses, not with swords but with spectacle. Give me 5 minutes, and I'll change the way you see power forever. They say if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The screaming, not of the man, they say he never made a sound, but of the mob, of their hunger, of their bloodlust, how it built and swelled and swallowed reason whole. On this morning, London isn't a city, it's a beast, and it wants to feed. The man they're dragging through the streets isn't dressed for the occasion. His clothes are ripped, stained, his wrists and ankles bound tight to the wooden frame of a hurdle cart as it scrapes over stone. Every bump jostles bone against bone. Children laugh and point, and above it all, above the rising sun and the hawkers and the cries of glee, a name travels on the wind. Wallace, William Wallace, Knight of Scotland, traitor to England, or so they say. What few in the crowd understand, what perhaps even Wallace himself doesn't fully realize, is that this isn't just an execution. It's a message, a ritual, a warning encoded in flesh and flame. This is justice, yes, but also theater, crafted carefully by King Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, the architect of dominion. And Wallace, whether he likes it or not, is no longer a man. He's a symbol, and symbols don't die quietly. They are killed with precision. But before the blade, before the noose, before the fire comes the silence, that dreadful silence, just before the act begins, that brief, unnatural stillness before the crowd exhales its fury. The tension stretches like gut over firewood. The guards shift uneasily. The executioner sharpens his blades slowly, so that everyone can hear it. And Wallace? He stares forward. Not at the gallows, not at the gallows, not at the gallows, not even at the king's men. He stares beyond them all, eyes fixed on something invisible. Perhaps it's his homeland. Perhaps it's just a memory. Perhaps it's the last piece of himself that hasn't yet been taken. You wonder if he feels fear, or pride, or just numb. But even that question is a luxury Wallace no longer has, because here, in this place, stripped of name and title and dignity, he is not asked what he feels. He is only asked to suffer, and suffer he will. This wasn't supposed to be how it ended. Not for him, not for Scotland. Once, only a few years before, he was the hope of a nation, rising not from the ranks of royalty, but from grief, from rage, from something far more dangerous than noble blood, belief. He had carved victory from chaos. At Stirling Bridge he had made giants fall. He had made kings tremble, but kings do not forgive. So now, the man who once held the line against England with nothing but his sword and his fury is here, bare-chested, bleeding, betrayed. A cautionary tale in human form. And yet, there's something off, because in the eyes of the executioner, in the hush of the wind, in the uneven rhythm of the crowd's cheers, something cracks. Just a little. Just enough. Enough for someone, anyone, to begin to wonder. If this man must be killed with such cruelty, with such desperation, then what are they really afraid of? Is it him? Or what he stood for? There, in that pause between breath and blade, The real horror unfolds, not just in the act of punishment, but in the realization that it might fail, that the memory of Wallace might live on, not in spite of this savagery, but because of it. And suddenly you feel it. Not pity, not even outrage, but dread. Because you understand, this isn't the end of a rebellion, it's the start of a legend. And legends, once born, do not die easily. Even as the blade rises, even as the fire is lit, even as the ropes tighten and the crowd erupts, hungry for conclusion, even then, it isn't over. It's strange how quietly a legend enters the stage. No thunder, no crown, no grand entrance. Just a boy, maybe 17, standing in the tall grass of Elderslie with hands blistered from labor and eyes that had already seen too much. William Wallace wasn't born to lead. He wasn't groomed in the courts or whispered about in war rooms. He was the kind of man history almost misses, until history has no choice but to stop and look. His father, a minor landowner, lost everything in the chaos of Scotland's long and tangled power struggle. English garrisons swallowed towns like a slow plague, and Wallace watched his home become something unrecognizable. Quiet fields turned into outposts, laughter replaced by silence. Loss became a language. He spoke it fluently. No one teaches you how to start a war. You just reach a point where survival and defiance become the same thing. When English soldiers murdered someone Wallace loved, some say it was his wife, others a brother, it wasn't just grief that followed. It was clarity. A fire, quiet and cold, that started in his chest and refused to die. He didn't ride out with an army. He had none. He didn't have armor. What he had was the kind of rage that makes a man fearless. And so, in the shadow of a bridge near Stirling, Wallace wrote his name in the blood of an empire. That was the first time the English truly noticed him. Stirling wasn't supposed to fall. Not to Scots, not to farmers and fishermen, but under Wallace it did, because he saw something others didn't. He saw that the English war machine, those columns of cavalry, the tight formations of steel, could bleed. And when the first English horsemen slipped on the narrow bridge, fell into the river, and drowned under their own weight, a crack split through the illusion of English invincibility. They called it a miracle. But Wallace knew better. It was mathematics, precision, timing. Fury sharpened into strategy. And then came Falkirk, the betrayal, the scattered bodies, the sting of arrows tearing through Scottish lines while their own nobles watched from a safe distance. They abandoned him there, not all at once, but piece by piece. Men who had pledged loyalty began to vanish. Promises turned soft. Whispers spread. Maybe Wallace had gone too far. Maybe peace was worth more than pride. The nobles, with their gold and their titles, made quiet deals while Wallace, covered in blood and grief, realized something terrible. That sometimes your greatest enemy is not the man across the battlefield. It's the one beside you who lays down his sword first. But Wallace kept moving, kept fighting, from the hills, from the forests, from the ruins of hope, until the walls around him began to close. Slowly. Edward wasn't merely trying to kill a man. He was trying to erase an idea. He sent spies, gold, promises of land. And one by one, Wallace's allies disappeared. Some defected. Some died. Some simply stopped answering. It wasn't cowardice. It was calculus. They looked at what had become of Wallace and saw a dead man walking. The reward on his head grew heavier. Fear does strange things to loyalty. And then came Sir John Menteith, a knight, a fellow Scot, once a friend, perhaps. It's hard to say. Some say he betrayed Wallace for coin. Others claim it was survival, that he was promised land or protection. But whatever the reason, one August night near Glasgow, Wallace was surrounded. No escape. No sword in hand, no escape. Just hands bound in chains and silence heavier than the earth beneath him. That silence, the silence of betrayal, is louder than any battlefield. What followed wasn't capture. It was theater, a display. The English paraded him through villages. Not quickly, not quietly, but as slow as possible. He was shown like a trophy. Like a warning. Town after town, they brought him forward so the people could see what resistance looked like after it was crushed. And yet, as the days dragged on, something strange began to happen. People didn't just look. Some wept. Others stayed silent, not in scorn but in shame, because they saw what the crown wanted them to forget. That Wallace wasn't a villain. He was a mirror. Even the air around him seemed to shift, as if the wind carried with it not just the stink of sweat and iron, but something older, something unspoken. There's power in a man who has nothing left to lose, and Edward felt it, even as he prepared the final act. But before that, there was a trial. If it could be called that. August 23rd, Westminster Hall. Marble floors polished to shine like ice, tall windows casting shadows that stretched like arms across the walls. Latin filled the air. Cold. Clipped, unreadable. Wallace didn't speak it. They knew that. It wasn't about justice. It was about dominance. He stood before men who had already written the ending, accused of treason against a king he never bowed to, murder, arson, sacrilege, charges designed to stain every inch of his memory. But when asked to answer, Wallace didn't plead. He didn't explain. He only said the truth, in a voice that cracked nothing but the illusion of authority. I never swore allegiance to Edward. And in that moment, even chained, he stood taller than every man in that room. The sentence was expected, the execution already rehearsed, but no one could prepare for what came next, because what they thought they were breaking was already breaking them, and what they thought they were ending was only just beginning. The truth is, Scotland wasn't supposed to matter this much. To England, it was meant to be just another stone to collect, a patch of land to fold under the crown, louder than Wales, colder than Ireland, but manageable. They never expected it to bleed so loudly. The chaos began, as most disasters do, with a vacuum. The Scottish throne sat empty after the death of Alexander III and his heir. No ruler, no heir, no direction. And in that void, Edward I saw his moment. A king with no opposition moves freely. So he arrived not with fire, but with arbitration. He offered to help, to settle disputes among Scottish nobles about who should wear the crown. But help from a conqueror is a dangerous gift. He installed John Balliol, a puppet king with a weak spine and a chained tongue, someone easier to control than to respect. And when Balliol eventually flinched, trying to assert Scottish sovereignty, Edward reminded everyone exactly who was holding the leash. He invaded. Again. But by then, the people had started to notice. The truth burned beneath the surface of towns and glens and hillsides. This wasn't alliance. It was occupation. And in that tension, from the shadows of uncertainty, something violent and undeniable began to stir. Resistance doesn't start with plans. It starts with anger. And out of that anger, Wallace rose. He wasn't the only rebel, but he was the loudest, the most unyielding. While nobles debated in smoky halls and weighed their chances between submission and survival, Wallace picked up a sword, not gilded, not ceremonial, just steel and vengeance. His early attacks weren't battles. They were messages, raids on English outposts, supply lines, soldiers too far from their commanders. He moved like smoke, struck like thunder. And every time he vanished into the woods, the myth grew a little bigger. But myths aren't built from survival. They're forged in defiance. At Stirling Bridge, Wallace found his stage. English forces, more disciplined, more numerous, more arrogant, marched in expecting obedience. What they got was slaughter. The Scots baited them across a narrow bridge, then unleashed chaos. Arrows blackened the sky. Swords found unarmored flesh. Horses reared and screamed as the river filled with bodies. It wasn't just victory, and the message was clear. Scotland would not kneel quietly. It was the kind of moment that echoes. For the first time, common men believed maybe, just maybe, freedom wasn't a dream. Maybe it was a cause worth dying for. Wallace became guardian of Scotland, not because he demanded it, but because no one else dared to take it. He led not from bloodline, but from fire. He wore his scars openly, and the English, suddenly, were afraid. But fear, like fire, spreads fast, and not always in the right direction. Wallace's rise rattled the power structures of Scotland as much as it did England. The nobles, those careful men who wore swords like jewelry and chose their loyalty based on which way the wind blew, began to worry. Wallace wasn't one of them. He didn't care for diplomacy or patience. or making himself small, and that made him dangerous. Then came Falkirk. It should have been another Stirling, but this time, the English came prepared. They brought archers, thousands. Wallace's lines were shredded before they even reached the enemy. Horses fell screaming. Men broke and ran. And worse, the nobles who were supposed to reinforce him never arrived. Some say they were late. Others say they never intended to come. Either way, the result was the same. Betrayal wrapped in silence. Wallace escaped. Barely. His sword arm bloodied, his voice raw from orders shouted into chaos. They said it was for unity, but what they meant was, you've become inconvenient. And yet, even in the shadows, he didn't stop. He didn't flee the country. He didn't flee the country. He didn't vanish into obscurity. He stayed, like a wound that refused to close. Because Wallace didn't fight for power. He fought because there was nothing else left. No peace to retreat into. No promise worth kneeling for. But Edward was patient. He knew how to wait, how to watch. He let Wallace bleed his energy into fading raids. Let the nobles think they'd bought themselves peace. Let the country believe the worst was over. Until the moment was right. Until the circle had tightened enough. And then, like a closing fist, he struck. And suddenly, everything changed. They thought he was finished. After Falkirk, after the nobles reclaimed their titles and England pressed in from the borders like a closing mouth, they believed the spark had burned out. Wallace disappeared into the folds of the Highlands, a man with no army, no allies, and, according to many, no future. But fire doesn't need permission to keep burning. It just needs air. And Wallace still breathed. In the months that followed, his resistance took a different shape. No longer the face of official leadership, he became something more elusive. He crossed forests like a ghost, striking supply lines, torching garrisons, vanishing before the smoke even cleared. In England's reports, he was everywhere and nowhere, a threat that refused to die, a memory with teeth. But even a ghost leaves a trail, and Edward knew it. The king's tactics shifted. He realized killing Wallace on the battlefield would only glorify him, but to destroy him as a man, to strip away the myth, inch by inch, that required something more patient, more sinister. So he turned to Scotland itself. It started slowly. The reward on Wallace's head increased, first in gold, then in promises. Land, titles, safety. He offered nobility to those who bent the knee, and whispered poison to those who hadn't. England didn't conquer Scotland in a single battle. It conquered it one betrayal at a time, clan by clan, friend by friend. Silence crept into the resistance like mold, growing in corners no one saw until it was too late. And Wallace saw it happening. He watched former allies strike deals in candlelit halls. Watched men who once raised swords beside him, now raise goblets to their English guests. Not all turned, but enough. Enough to thin the ranks. Enough to shake loyalty. The rebellion began to splinter, not from fear of England, but from fear of futility. Men wanted to live, the walls tighter, and the faces more uncertain. Trust became a luxury. He slept with one eye open and rode under clouded skies. Every knock at a door could be a friend or a trap. Every shadow whispered coin. And slowly, methodically, the circle closed. Then, one night near Glasgow, it did. Sir John Menteith had once fought beside Wallace, a knight of Scotland. Trusted. Familiar. Some say they drank together. Others claim Wallace saved his life once. None of that mattered anymore. Menteith handed him over, quietly, efficiently. No blades, no warning. Just hands shackled in the dark and an English escort waiting like wolves behind the tree line. The story goes that Wallace said nothing. Not a curse, not a cry. Just stared at Menteith for a long, long time until the knight looked away. And that was the real execution. Right there in the forest. Because what followed was merely the procession. The English didn't rush him to London. They made it slow, deliberate. A parade of humiliation across every town and village. He wasn't led. He was dragged, tied to a cart, spat upon, jeered, displayed like some strange trophy. This wasn't justice. It was theater. A traveling horror show where the ticket price was silence and the message clear. Resistance will rot you in public. But Wallace never broke. Even when children laughed, even when townspeople mocked him in languages he couldn't speak, even when they dressed his agony as entertainment. He didn't look away, as if daring them to look back. By the time he reached London, his name was legend and his body a map of bruises. They gave him a trial, but only in name. Latin words, English judges, an outcome written in the margins before the first question was asked. Treason, murder, arson, rebellion. The charges were stacked like firewood, and the sentence was a match. But even then, he reminded them who he was. I never swore to Edward, he said. A simple truth, but one that cracked the floor beneath them. Because if Wallace wasn't a subject, then what he did wasn't treason. It was war. And war demands a different kind of punishment. Or so they thought. Because now, what they feared most was not what he had done, but what he might become. Not a rebel, not a martyr, but something much harder to kill. An idea. Morning broke over London with an eerie calm. The streets glistened as if scrubbed clean, the sky too clear, too still, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The scaffold had been prepared days in advance, not hidden away in some back alley, but raised high in the heart of Smithfield, where it could be seen from every angle, by every eye. This wasn't justice, it was performance. A final act scripted in cruelty, a public ritual designed not to correct, but to command. Wallace had arrived the night before, locked in irons, dragged through streets lit with torches and murmurs. And now, as the sun crept higher, the square began to fill. Children perched on shoulders. Merchants shut their stalls. Laughter rippled, low and brittle. Somewhere nearby, a woman sold meat pies to the crowd. Another passed ale. This was not mourning. It was a holiday for pain. They called it execution. But what they had in mind had a different name. Treason, they said. Rebellion. They dressed it in law. But the tools, rope, knives, fire, spoke a language older than law. One meant to unravel a man slowly, deliberately, piece by bloody piece. The cart creaked into the square, carrying a shape that was still unmistakably human, though barely. Wallace, bare-chested, bruised, his hands tied tight behind his back, looked like a ruin, and yet his eyes hadn't dulled. They scanned the crowd, the scaffold, the blue of the sky. He didn't look afraid, not serene either, just aware, present. Not serene. And that, somehow, was worse. They tied him to the hurdle, a rough wooden frame, and hitched it to a horse. The procession began, a slow, grinding journey through London's busiest streets. The route wasn't chosen for efficiency. It was chosen for effect. Past shops, past churches, past families who'd waited hours to see what pain looked like up close. The stones beneath him were uneven, and every jolt tore skin from bone. But he didn't scream. Not once. Onlookers threw filth. Some shouted insults. Others stared in silence. One boy reached out to touch him as he passed, just to say he had. By the time they reached the scaffold, blood painted the wood and his breathing came in shallow waves. But they weren't finished. Not even close. He was pulled up onto the platform, tied once again and forced to his knees. The executioner stepped forward, cloaked, gloved, silent. Wallace's head was bowed, then lifted, then held. The rope went around his neck. Tight, but not tight enough to kill. That was the point. The trapdoor dropped. His body fell, and then hung. But only for a moment. They cut him down before his heart gave out. What followed no words can prepare for. Because it wasn't death. It was dissection. A theater of agony. He was strapped down, arms spread wide, chest heaving, still conscious. The knife appeared. Not fast. Not clean. They started with the abdomen, slicing downward, peeling back skin and muscle. Blood spilled across the planks in rhythmic spurts. The crowd, stunned at first, leaned in. Gasps turned to laughter. Somewhere, someone vomited. But no one left. The executioner reached in, pulling organs one by one, holding them high before tossing them into the fire. The smell was unbearable. Burned flesh, bile, something darker. Wallace's body jerked, but his eyes, they never closed. His intestines, his liver, his heart, one by one, still alive, still watching, still refusing to break. It should have ended there, but the script demanded more. Finally, mercifully, they beheaded him. Clean, quick, final. But even that was not the end. His head was dipped in tar, stuck on a pike, and mounted on London Bridge. a grim sentinel to every soul crossing into the city, a message etched in wrought. His body now quartered. Arms, legs, chest was sent across the land. Stirling, Berwick, Newcastle, Perth. The pieces displayed publicly, a macabre map of submission, each limb a warning, each city a reminder. But something shifted, not in the sky, not in the laws, in the people, because the message didn't land the way Edward hoped. Instead of fear, they remembered. Instead of silence, they whispered. Stories began to spread of Wallace's courage, his defiance, his final moments. He had not cried. He had not begged. He had endured. And in doing so, he became something more dangerous than a man. He became memory. And memories don't bleed. They spread. They thought the spectacle would silence the storm. They thought blood would bind the borders. They thought fear, once soaked into the earth, would settle everything. But a strange thing happened in the days that followed Wallace's death. The quiet never came. In fact, the noise only changed shape, because what they failed to understand, what tyrants so often fail to understand, is that when you make a man suffer in front of thousands, when you make a whole city stare into the open chest of defiance, you don't kill the idea. You broadcast it. His head hung over London Bridge for years, blackened, hollow-eyed, jaw locked in permanent protest. It didn't terrify everyone the way Edward hoped. Some looked away. But others looked up and whispered his name like a prayer, not because they admired his violence, but because they'd seen what power does to a man who says no, and they couldn't forget it. The body parts that traveled north, one to Newcastle, one to Berwick, one to Stirling, one to Perth, did not rot in isolation. They pulsed, they breathed, they whispered from gibbets and iron hooks. In each city, they became more than flesh. They became a warning, yes, but not just for rebels, for rulers, because in each piece, Scotland didn't see surrender. It saw a dare, and somewhere in that scattered legacy, something else stirred. It didn't happen overnight. For a time, resistance did falter. The memory of his execution was too fresh, too raw. People kept their heads down. Rebellion, for a while, shrank to a whisper. But the whisper grew. And then, out of the silence, a man stood up. His name was Robert Bruce. He had once fought on both sides, hesitant, calculating, torn. But Wallace's death changed him. It made the choice unavoidable. There could be no middle, no safety in neutrality. Wallace had been punished not for treason, but for reminding people they could choose who they died for. And Bruce chose. He launched a war not for England's approval, but for Scotland's soul. His tactics, smaller, sharper, crueler, bore the mark of a man who had studied what the English did to Wallace and knew the cost of capture. He never allowed himself to be taken. He never gave the enemy the chance to turn his body into another lesson. The war turned, slowly, brutally. Blood flooded both sides. Towns burned. Faith was bought and sold and betrayed 100 times. But underneath it all, a new rhythm began to pulse through the highlands and lowlands alike. A beat no army could silence. Wallace's name passed from mouth to mouth across firesides and battlefields, passed not as a ghost but as a spark. Even Edward couldn't escape it. The king who'd orchestrated the killing, who'd sharpened every part of the blade meant for Wallace's throat. He died 2 years later on the campaign trail, trying to finish the job. His body rotted in the saddle before it made it home. They say he ordered his bones to be carried into battle, so his corpse could still face the Scots. But by then, his enemy was already something he couldn't touch, because Wallace didn't die at Smithfield. Not really. He died 100 times, in every scream, every flame, every mile of dragged flesh. But in doing so, he multiplied. His body broke, but the silence never returned. And that was the failure. Because Edward had built his kingdom on the belief that suffering ends resistance. But suffering doesn't kill resistance. Sometimes, suffering is what makes it impossible to stop. Some deaths end stories. Others begin them. Wallace's ended in fire and rope and smoke, but what followed was not stillness. It was echo. It moved differently, slow at first, like a breath caught in the lungs of a people who'd seen too much to speak, and then louder, steadier, pulsing through valleys, through taverns, through memory. It carried through the generations, not as a tale of how he died, but why he chose to. And maybe that's what unsettled the most. Not the horror of the execution itself, though it lingered like a wound in the collective mind, but the silence he kept. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't try to rewrite his ending, because Wallace wasn't clinging to survival. He was daring the world to watch, and in that final defiance, he took something from them. Not land, not victory, but the illusion that fear could win forever. The English thought they had orchestrated a deterrent. What they created was a blueprint, a warning to others not of what rebellion cost, but of what submission became. And in every place his name was whispered after, a quiet decision formed, that if you must die, better to die with something in your chest unbroken. Centuries passed, but the air in certain parts of Scotland still felt heavier, thick with things not said but known. Wallace's name no longer belonged to a man. It belonged to the moment a country looked at its chains and saw not iron, but the hands that forged them. People romanticize revolution, but they rarely understand what it asks. It asks everything. It doesn't just take your comfort. It asks for your body, your legacy, your name, your silence. And still, it demands more. Wallace didn't die because he thought he would win. He died because he knew someone had to show that it could be done. That the body breaks but principle doesn't have to. What's left of him now? No grave. No remains. Just bone dust scattered by centuries and stone bridges that remember more than they tell. But also, something heavier. Something nobody could burn. The lesson that pain can become purpose. That spectacle fades, but sacrifice stains. And then there's us. Comfortable, fed, distant from the noose, and yet still walking streets paved by the fear of men like Edward, and held together by the courage of men like Wallace. Freedom feels normal now, passive, but it was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be earned, and kept, and questioned, and sometimes, though hopefully never again, belled for. There's something unsettling about realizing that everything you take for granted was once worth torturing a man for. The right to speak, to dissent, to call your country your own. These weren't gifts. They were clawed out of history by hands that never got to enjoy them. So the next time someone tells you history is over, or that the past is the past, remember this. Wallace died screaming in silence while an empire cheered. And still he won, because they broke his body, but they couldn't bury what he believed. And somewhere, even now, on some quiet night, when the wind howls low and the fire crackles just right, you might still hear it. Not the scream, but the breath he never took. Still waiting. Still asking. What would you do with your one chance not to kneel? Sometimes, the most powerful truths aren't shouted in victory. They're whispered through suffering. They echo not from thrones or parliaments, but from the quiet resilience of those who chose to stand, even when standing meant being broken. History remembers battles, but it's built on moments of impossible courage, often seen by no one but felt by everyone. There's something profoundly human about the act of resistance, not the kind that wins medals or headlines, but the kind that says, I will not disappear quietly. We live in a world that rewards compromise, praises politeness, and sells silence as wisdom. But every right we hold, every freedom we enjoy, was once wild, unthinkable, dangerous. The comfort we have now was carved by the discomfort of those who came before us, not with ease, not without cost, but with purpose. The pain of the past is not a museum piece. It breathes, it hums beneath the skin of nations, and in the quiet between our daily noise. And while most of us may never be asked to risk everything for an ideal, we are asked, every single day, to choose who we are in small, invisible ways, to speak when silence is easier, to stay when walking away is simpler, to carry even lightly the weight of a world that was paid for in blood and principle. What endures beyond governments, beyond names carved in stone, is this: the refusal to surrender the better parts of ourselves, compassion in the face of cruelty, hope in the midst of despair, and dignity, even when stripped of everything else. These are the legacies worth keeping. These are the stories worth telling. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. That in the end, it's not about the monuments or the scars. It's about remembering that justice is not guaranteed, freedom is not permanent, and silence is never neutral. That we, the living, carry an inheritance shaped not just by victories, but by the voices that refuse to die unheard. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story moved you, made you pause, reflect, or feel even a flicker of something deeper, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from, what time of night you found this, and if you'd like to keep walking through history's quiet corridors with us, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and join our little circle of night thinkers, because the past still speaks. All we have to do is listen.